Let's talk about the importance of stitching out your decorative stitches. Sometimes people call this stitching out a stitch book. And I'm going to give you a couple ideas that will give you a place to start, and then you can decide to what level you take this to. So first off, what are you doing? You're taking just picking a decorative stitch. Maybe you have a menu or a whole row that you're working with, and then starting with the foot next to the edge of the fabric and sewing down that entire length. Pick the next stitch and sew it with the presser foot touching the previous stitch. That's how I do it. So prepping the fabric, we're talking about some fabric that might be 5 by 10 inches. That's a great option if you choose to put it in a notebook. So sometimes on our supply list, we'll actually talk about just having some sheet protectors and then some cardstock that you can actually just kind of slip in, and then as you stitch a couple areas or groups of stitches, you can slip it in. You know what I've often done too is, as I've had something that might just be a little extra piece that I love, I don't want to throw it away, I have a little place to put it. So sometimes in here I'll have some other little smaller pieces running around that I can always go, oh yeah, I remember when I did that, and I can see what those settings are. Some people will go to the extent of maybe putting the numbers up on the cardstock. You could write them in. I have seen stitch books that have been stitched with which numbers you're doing. Speaking of numbers, if you have stitched out all your decorative stitches, believe me, you're going to know where most of these stitches are. So one thing you can pick, though, is for some people, they've talked and said that they see stitches easier on black thread of fabric, and I've had some people say that they see their stitches easier on white fabric. When you get into threads, your choice, whether you want to have some fun with some variegated thread or even using the solid colors. Oh my gosh, this was when I was doing some triple needle. So again, a place that I could slide that in and keep a little reference of that. Let me show you what I'm working on right now. This is some of the stitches out of the new FOF icon, and I've been taking the pieces, stitching with a single layer of tearaway stabilizer behind the fabric. And let me tell you a little trick about stitching this out, or I should say cutting your fabric. When you cut your fabric, for the distance of approximately 4 to 5 inches across, that's usually enough for you to get an idea of how big the stitch repeat is. Some stitches repeat very quickly. Others, they're like an entire bow or hearts, and you got to know how big they are. But this is usually enough to give you an idea of how big the repeat is. Now, when you cut your fabric, when you hold your fabric up, you're going to notice that this part here on my fabric, the short distance, is the stable direction or the lengthwise grain of your fabric. If I hadn't cut off the selvage edge, it would be right here. This side, the widthwise part of your fabric, is a little stretchier. So if you were a decorative stitch and you were stitching on stretchier fabric, you might kind of wrinkle that as you go. So my suggestion is when you cut fabric for, say, preparing to sew your stitch book, cut it so the lengthwise grain is along the short distance. Put a piece of fabric stabilizer behind it and just make yourself a little pile of these. And also, you're going to need it for some sampling of your stitches before you stitch on your block. So beside my machine, I usually have 1 or 2 of these. So I can just stitch. I can make sure my thread is to my liking. The stitch is the one that I remember I'm picking. I can test tension as well. And so usually I just have these short little tests of a stitch prior to actually applying it to the finished block. So you're going to need to have some of these anyway set aside. And then what I'm doing, let me finish up what I was talking about with this collection here, is I was actually taking the pieces and going back to front, gluing 2 together, and then using a rotary cutter with a pinking blade, and that's how I've gone in and cut and trimmed these. So for right now, they're just loose, and honestly, my students love to just pick through them or flip them over, look at all the stitches. I don't care that they get out of order. The idea is that they look at them and see how fun they are. Now, if you and okay, I gotta give my husband credit for this. My husband, Steve, started stitching out some stitches just like this, with each one being a different color with neon threads, and I fell in love with it. Well, I couldn't let it go. He only stitched like the first 20 stitches and then just kind of left it for me. So the story goes that I couldn't leave it alone, and so I had to. And so I think you really see each stitch individually when those threads are each different. I'm not saying that that's something you want to do, but I have had a lot of students do it. And the trick was I didn't just sew one row with, for example, the pink thread and then switch thread to the next color. I actually had multiple pages going at one exact time. So I might put pink on the machine, and then I stitched this stitch one from this menu and this stitch one from the next menu, and I had them labeled. And if I kind of stayed semi-focused, I was able to keep track of jumping, just touching the screen and moving from menu to menu as I changed colors. So I was sewing anywhere from 4 to 7, maybe even up to 10 different pages at a time with one thread. And then when I got all the way through a series, then I switched threads and then kept going. I really love the effect. Now, one more thing about the stitch books that you could do. For me, just getting them stitched out on these top-of-line sewing machines is a feat. So for those of you who finish, I salute you. But if you wanted to take this one step further, is you sew out a couple repeats of a stitch, and then you might change the width and length. And by changing the width and length at different intervals, so you might narrow it and then sew a little bit, and then you might make it longer and sew a little bit, and a couple combinations of each, the stitch you started with is not going to look like the stitch that you finished with. And it's going to give you even more inspiration and know how that stitch is going to look when you stitch it out. Now, just a quick idea, when we get to double needles, you could take all these stitches once again and stitch them with a double needle and make a whole entire new stitch book just with how the stitch looks kind of intertwined with 2 threads. Oh my gosh, just wait till we get to double needles. As you can see, I get excited. So another one is if you wanted to take and buy some sheet protectors with like the business card holders, and then just sew out one little repeat of each of or a couple repeats of each of the stitch. That's a great way to kind of have a flip through stitch book that you can come back to at any time. That's a great option. I love that particular look. Speaking of decorative stitches, I just want to make one little note. Like I said, I'm a Craftsy instructor, now Blueprint, and along the lines of other instructors that I fell in love with, Carol Ann Waugh has a Blueprint class, and it is in your handouts, but we'll make sure you know the links and everything. She has a class called Stupendous Stitching. Stupendous Stitching is a fun way of using decorative stitches. You know, we're doing kind of this stitching cosmos. We're doing it on a block, but she takes it to a whole entire level. She'll do it almost as an art form and frame them or cut out fabric that she has created. You can kind of see by the front of this book what I'm talking about. So if you kind of just fall in love with threads and decorative stitches, and guess what her first lesson that she talks about? Yes, stitching out a stitch book. So as you can see, this is a book that you can get as well, and we'll give you in our reference or resource pages, we will put this in there. And again, she goes into and talks about lots of different threads. She does do a lot of couching, which is coming up in our lesson too. But she plays around with a lot of fabrics for fun backgrounds. And you know what? I bet here is her stitch book. There it is, where she's taken, and even with some of these, she has taken where the stitches do change for different widths, 3 different settings as they're sewn. She kind of stitched them and then kind of put them together in a little kind of grommets along the edge. So great way to save all those fabulous stitches and be able to reference them at a later time. So the sooner you get going on your stitch book, the happier and easier it will be to select stitches as we move between all the lessons.